Welcome back to part 2 of our double podcast about the 1987 struggles in South Korea. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I'd go back and listen to that first. As a quick reminder, our podcast is brought to you by our Patreon supporters. We're only able to dedicate large amounts of time to researching, producing and editing these episodes, as well as doing all of our other historical work because of support from you. In return, our patrons get exclusive early access to podcast episodes, ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, free and discounted merchandise and other content. So if you can, join us and find out more at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. As a content note, this episode contains a brief mention of suicide. Where we left off last time, the US-backed military dictatorship in South Korea had been racked by protests for 2.5 weeks. Repression had just made them grow, and the government decided against calling in the military. So there was only one option left to them, which they announced on the 29th of June, which was to cave to the protesters' primary demand to introduce direct presidential elections. A few days later, Lee Han-yeol, the student who'd been in a coma since being hit in the head by a tear gas canister, died, and 1 million people took to the streets to attend his funeral. The fall of the regime also prompted a huge burst in labour organising, which had been underground and very difficult for a long time.
Although labor movements had started in Korea before independence from Japanese colonial rule, they were suppressed severely. The so-called leftist camp saw a resurgence of large-scale labor movements, mainly driven by female workers in light industries in the 1970s.
This is Hong Seung-ha, a student activist at the time who we heard from in part 1. We talk about this resurgence of the workers' movement by mostly women garment and textile workers in the 1970s in our podcast episode 51. By the mid-1980s, working class discontent had been bubbling under the surface for years, and with open organisation illegal, much of this emerged in culture. A generation of working class writers came to be in the 1980s, like Park No-hae, a worker poet who wrote about workers' lives and alienation. This is his poem, Maybe.
Maybe I'm a machine, absorbed in soldering sub-assemblies, swarming down the conveyor, like a robot repeating the same motions forever. Maybe I become a machine. Maybe we are chickens in a coop, neatly lined up on our roosts, hens be synchronized in dim light. The faster the music, the more eggs we lay. Maybe we've become chickens in a coop. They who extract and devour our peace and our marrow. Maybe they are bare-faced robbers, tinning humans into machines, into consumables, into things buyable and sellable. Maybe they are dignified and law-abiding bare-faced robbers. Those gentle smiles, that refined beauty and culture, that rich and dazzling opulence, maybe all of that is ours.
The workers' and pro-democracy movements also produced their own culture and music. Progressive church and workers' organisations developed cultural activities. By the middle of the 1980s, most unions have their own Pungmul and Talchum groups, referring to traditional peasant band music and masked dance groups. Many workers took part in these just for fun, but they were also used to build a sense of class unity and solidarity. The view of one worker explained its importance. He said, quote, "The feeling I often get while playing Pungmul is the feeling of togetherness." End quote.
민중가요 많았어요. 네, 민중가요 한 책.
There were many movement songs. There seemed to be about 3 books of movement songs. Among them, March for the Beloved continues to be sung a lot. Personally, my favorite is Four Seasons by People Seeking Songs. It's a song about female textile workers, and I like Kim Kwang-seok's Those Days too.
When strikes and occupations did take place in the 80s, they were almost always accompanied by pungmul and talchum activities. Workers and union groups and pro-worker Christian organisations also published working-class newspapers with articles about workers' rights, criticism of the government, and reports about industrial disputes. All of this contributed to a collective sense of identity held by many Korean workers. According to Hagen Koo, author of Korean Workers, The Culture and Politics of Class Formation, even just using the word worker, 노동자, to self-identify implied a sense of working-class pride, antagonism, and resistance.
그 87년 6월 항쟁으로 이제 어쨌든
After the June 10th uprising, there was a sense of confidence in the victory of the democratization movement. And as an extent of that, the great worker struggle occurred in July, August, and September of 1987. Large-scale strikes took place, and workers formed unions in major conglomerates like the Hyundai Group. Overall, the number of labor unions increased by about 3 to 4 times.
Workers, full of confidence from the June democratic struggle, set about organising independent unions under their own control and fighting for better pay and conditions.
이미 거리에서 민주주의를 익혔던
Then came the fight of the Democratic Union. So I believe that the workers were at the root of the June struggle.
This is Kim Jin-sook, a shipyard worker and labour organiser who was fired before the June struggle and who was involved in the protests as well. She saw firsthand how the June movement energised workers and led to what happened next.
곧이어서 그 다음 달부터
This certainly was a catalyst to July, August, September. The actions of the workers who fought for democracy from all industries. And this truly helped challenge the old idea of dictatorship. And it created the new trade unions, which had frighteningly powerful momentum to fight the dictatorship.
After the dictatorship fell, workers began organising immediately. At Hyundai in Ulsan, workers at a few of their plants formed unions in the few days after the 29th of June declaration. Over the next 3 weeks, workers at 12 other plants unionised as well. Together, they agreed a list of demands, including pay increases of up to 30%. After these demands were rejected by management, Hyundai workers held a mass march through the city, which they then followed up with another march 9 days later, headed by vehicles they'd made, including dump trucks, fire engines, and sandblasting machines. Riot police tear-gassed and attacked the workers, but the workers fought back, overwhelming the police and forcing them to flee. The following day, workers took to the streets once more with their wives and children to march to the local sports stadium. Once more, they drove heavy vehicles at the front of the march, but this time, the vehicles were followed by a column of workers wearing hard hats and gas masks. The sight of this alone was enough to force the amassed army of 4,500 riot police to retreat. Upon arriving at the stadium and meeting with government representatives there, it was announced that all of the workers' demands had been agreed, including union recognition. This apparent victory at Hyundai was hugely important. Hyundai was the biggest of the chaebol, the family-run conglomerates which dominated the South Korean economy. Like other chaebol companies, Hyundai was strongly anti-union. Its founder, Chung Ju-young, used to tell his workers, quote, "I will never allow a union until earth covers my eyes," end quote. Major strikes and protests broke out first in southern coastal cities like Ulsan, Busan and Masan, the latter two of which were the scene of anti-dictatorship uprisings in 1979. But within a month, the strikes had begun in the capital, Seoul, and by late August, the whole country had been hit by an unprecedented wave of walkouts, which would become known as the Great Workers' Struggle. Workers were demanding shorter hours and pay increases of between 25 and 60%. They also demanded better, freer lives at work, like better food and an end to restrictions on personal clothing and hairstyles, the abolition of enforced morning company exercises, the scrapping of employee evaluation systems by management, and the abolition of the distinction between white-collar office workers and blue-collar factory workers within firms. At its peak, 1.2 million workers were on strike, about a third of the regularly employed workforce, in most major industries including mining, transportation, manufacturing, services, and docks. Almost all of the strikes were illegal wildcat strikes, which ignored anti-strike laws which required things like mandatory cooling-off periods between making demands and taking strike action. Action was also often militant. In addition to walking out, workers started seizing buildings, blocking streets, and taking managers hostage, action known as boss napping. By the end of 1987, there had been nearly 4,000 strikes, compared with under 300 the previous year. It was even more than the total number of strikes which had taken place in the whole country since the early 1960s. As the movement escalated, over 100 disputes started breaking out every single day. With a background of mass strikes, plans to hold direct presidential elections were put to a public vote.
하겠다고 했어요. 그렇게 해서 그다음에 국민투표를 해서
A national referendum was held, and over 90% of the people supported the direct presidential election amendment, leading to the direct presidential election. Presidential elections were held in the winter of 1987.
The election took place in December 1987, and while the Democratic movement had all agreed on the demand for democratic presidential elections, they didn't have a unified vision of what should happen next.
그런 평가들이 있었거든요. 그래서 이제
In the progressive movement, we found ourselves facing a presidential election in an unprepared situation. At that time, within the social movement, Baek Kyi-won was nominated as the presidential candidate. Initially, Baek Kyi-won declined to run for president. However, young people gathered and wrote blood petitions urging Baek Kyi-won to run. We believed we needed a candidate of the people, so we supported Baek Kyi-won as a candidate, and he decided to run.
Baek Kyi-won was a veteran of struggles for workers' rights and against the dictatorship. He took part in the April Revolution of 1960, which temporarily toppled the dictatorship before it was swiftly reintroduced. In the 1970s, he was repeatedly imprisoned and tortured, and was active in protests in 1986 and 1987. In the end, multiple candidates from the Democratic movement put themselves forward for election to run against Roh Tae-woo, the army officer who was the candidate put forward by the party of the dictatorship, the Democratic Liberal Party.
그런데 후보 단일화를 해서
We thought Roh Tae-woo should not win, so we demanded candidacy unification. Baek Kyi-won withdrew his candidacy, demanding for candidacy unification.
While Baek withdrew from the race, as did the candidate of the Social Democratic Party, others didn't.
시작이었던 것 같아요. 근데 그때는
The presidential election in 1987 ended up with a four-way race. Roh Tae-woo, Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, and Kim Jong-pil from the Chungcheong region ran as candidates, creating a four-way race.
Kim Jong-pil was another right-winger who was closely associated with the dictatorship, but with far less support than Roh.
근데 결국 양김 씨가 후보 단일화를 안
In the end,
자기가 될
Kim
줄
Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam did not unify their candidacy. Both believed they would become president.
On the anti-dictatorship side, Kim Young-san of the Reunification Democratic Party and Kim Dae-jung of the Peace Democratic Party both ran for president, after Kim Dae-jung split from the Reunification Party. On the policy side, everyone was talking about the sort of changes they wanted for the future.
그때 무상의료, 무상교육, 부유세.
At that time, there were many progressive policies proposed such as free healthcare, free education, and wealth taxes. So I found the election campaign at that time very exciting. In 1987, debates were happening everywhere. Whenever people gathered, discussions like, we need a constitutional amendment for direct election. We must reform now. We need to change the entire country were common. Also, there were many debates about socialism during that time.
When the election eventually came round, the results weren't what the protesters had hoped for.
완전 박빙이었거든요. 그러니까 노태우, 김대중,
During the presidential election, Tae-woo, Kim Dae-jung, and Kim Young-sam each received close to 30% support. However, it was Tae-woo who became the president.
Even though Democratic candidates received a majority of votes, 55% between them, Roh Tae-woo received the most votes for a single candidate, just under 37%, winning the election.
그 실패의 원인은 양김의 분열이랄까요?
The root cause of the failure is the division between Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam. It was the division between these two candidates and their ambitions for power. Additionally, because the Korean peninsula is divided, there is also a tendency for about 30% of the rigid conservative vote to always exist. And at that time, Roh Tae-woo became president because of those votes. He probably became president with the lowest vote share. When you combine the votes for Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam, it's over 50%. Each received about 28%.
As it happens behind the scenes, the military regime had planned to rig the election and launch a renewed crackdown on the opposition if they lost the election. But in the end, with the split in the Democratic vote, this wasn't needed. While the party of the dictatorship won the presidency, it didn't mean the return of the dictatorship as such, because they'd been forced to change the constitution.
사실 그럼에도 불구하고
Roh Tae-woo's presidency did not mark the return of military dictatorship, because the people achieved the direct election of the president through their own power and efforts for the direct election system. It is difficult to see it as an extension of military dictatorship. However, the fact that Roh Tae-woo, a remnant of military dictatorship, regained power left us with a profound sense of loss. I wanted to emigrate. I was on the streets throughout 1987, but the result gave me a tremendous sense of loss.
The mass protests of the June democratic struggle succeeded in toppling the dictatorship, but that wouldn't necessarily lead to changes in most people's everyday lives, especially for poor and working class people. But through the great workers' struggle, workers learned how they could really transform their lives, and they lost their fear of employers, the government, and repression.
탄압들이 컸죠. 탄압들이 크고.
Yes, there were mass firings, there were major restrictions and bans, but the problem for them was that the workers experienced an awakening. They were resilient and did not bend. This is the bravery of the workers who tirelessly fought on the front lines, on the streets during the June struggle. The unwavering will to continue the struggle and make their demands heard. I believe that the workers learned of their true power during the June struggle. The workers' chanting was the loudest, and the side dishes and the food at the table increased. Allowances within families became larger. There were economic benefits.
Witnessing the potential power of the working class also transformed a lot of the student activists, many of whom, like Hwang, soon got involved in the labour movement, often in secret.
그래서 그러니까 아는 사람 신분증을 빌려서
Many people borrowed others' identification to work as a disguised employees. During the Great Worker Struggle, there were likely many activists who engaged in undercover work at labor sites. Later, I went to Kuro Industrial Complex in 1990. I belonged to the last generation of activists who transitions from student activism to labor movement. So I used my own identification but falsified my university education, claiming to be a high school graduate, to get employed at Kuro Industrial Complex. I had 2 jobs, but I was fired from both after a few months. When they conducted background checks, my activist history came to light.
In the Great Workers' Struggle, many workers won their demands, with pay increases of 20 to 30% being typical. But workers also wanted to hold on to these gains and form permanent organisations, unions which they controlled, to forward their interests in the future. By the end of 1988, up to 4,000 new unions had been formed, and around 700,000 workers joined unions. And these unions were at least broadly democratic, about as much as unions in Western democracies. not like the corrupt and pliant company unions which existed before. Back at Hyundai, while the government agreed to workers' demands during the strike, the employers afterwards refused to honour some of them. So the dispute there came to a head later, in what would become the country's longest industrial dispute, a strike which would last 128 days. Workers went out on strike on the 12th of December 1988, demanding contract improvements and the reinstatement of 4 sacked union activists. They also began sit-ins on company property. On the 28th of December, President Roh made an announcement on civic security, stating that the comparatively tolerant approach the government had taken to industrial disputes and protests since the fall of the dictatorship was changing, and instead, authorities would once again be taking a firm hand. The following day, police attacked the Hyundai workers' sit-in in Seoul and evicted them. But strikes and other occupations of Hyundai plants proliferated. And although police and thugs hired by Hyundai attacked strikers on many occasions, the workers defended themselves vigorously. The strike culminated in a huge battle which began at dawn on the 30th of March 1989. 15,000 police, including notoriously violent units known as Paikgoldan, who were trained in martial arts, besieged the factory by land, sea and air, using boats, helicopters and road vehicles. Meanwhile, workers had prepared an arsenal of homemade weapons to defend themselves, including trench mortars and firebombs. Captured workers were brutally beaten by the Paikgoldan, which provoked others to come and support the strikers. Students travelled to the area to support the workers, local residents joined the protests, and in particular, the wives and children of the Hyundai workers joined the street battles. They blocked streets to prevent police movements, housed student strike supporters, and collected bottles to make petrol bombs. Eventually, after 10 days of the street battles, police succeeded in evicting the strikers and putting an end to the strike. 53 workers were arrested and 55 fired. While the strike was unsuccessful in winning reinstatement for the sacked union activists at that time, it did get other improvements. For example, Hyundai wages increased by over 23% in 1987 and over 28% in 1988. According to Hagen Koo, it was successful in achieving something else as well. He explained, quote, "Solidarity was born, and a high level of class awareness and political consciousness was in evidence among the growing number of workers who participated in the struggle. The union became stronger and more democratic in operation, and union membership increased significantly. On the shop floor too, workers were organised into small groups or committees and began to have a voice in many job-related issues. All these changes meant that managers had lost substantial power over workers on the shop floor. They even became afraid of militant workers." End quote. With this new confidence and real organisation they'd developed, the workers were then able to push for more, and in August 1989, they were able to win back reinstatement for the workers who were sacked during the dispute which ended earlier that year. These and many more struggles were fought in the months and years after June 1987, which really transformed South Korea into more what it's like today, with massively improved pay and working conditions for the majority of people, and a decisively different balance in power between workers and employers. One thing which didn't really change, however, was gender relations in the highly patriarchal society.
87년도 당시만 하더라도
In this country, just in 1987 and for the years that followed, there were no rights for women. There wasn't even a concept of women's rights then. So at the workplaces with mostly women workers, the union relations were all led by men, all of the union officials were men, and the democratic labor movement was started by men, or at least that's the history that we're told. But truthfully, in the 70s, despite the ongoing oppression, the ones who initiated the democratic labor movement were women. Women workers were the ones in the lead. And for women to receive that spotlight and even an acknowledgement in history, that did not come for a very long time. Acknowledgement of women in these movements came decades later, and only because women leaders fought for that acknowledgement. The women's chants, their struggle, no one gave them the attention or acknowledgement.
With the restoration of at least a measure of democracy and the emergence of a confident and militant working class movement, the state and employers had to find new ways of managing dissent rather than the brute force repression which preceded it. After the government of Roh Tae-woo, in successive elections, both of the main opposition leaders, Kim Young-sam and Kim Dae-jung, ended up winning and becoming president in 1992 and 1998 respectively. Under Kim Young-sam, former dictator Chun Doo-won and Roh Tae-woo were put on trial for their role in the coup in 1979 which put Chun in power, for corruption, and for the massacre of pro-democracy protesters in Gwangju in 1980, which we talk about in our episodes 53 to 56. They were convicted, and Chun was sentenced to death and Roh to life imprisonment. At the end of Kim Young-sam's term, Kim Dae-jung was elected. Together, they both agreed that they should pardon the former rulers for their crimes, and so Chun and Roh went free. With respect to workers, as usually happens in this situation, neither of the new democratic presidents took a substantially different position to the working class as their right-wing predecessors, especially once they took power and were responsible for running the capitalist economy. They then had to further the interest of capital in that economy, which meant turning the screws on workers for the benefit of big corporations. On the 26th of December 1996, Kim Young-sam's government met secretly and passed new labour laws reducing employment rights, giving employers more powers to sack workers and hire scab replacements during strikes. Essentially, the plan was to increase casualisation, that is, the replacement of permanent, contracted and salaried jobs with more rights, with temporary employment with fewer rights. But the working class was still willing and able to defend itself. The day workers heard the news, the recently formed militant Korean Confederation of Trade Unions, KCTU, met and resolved to call a general strike. That same day, 145,000 workers walked out. Even the Conservative Federation of Korean Trade Unions, FKTU, which was the federation of company unions under the dictatorship, called a limited strike of its members. By the third day, nearly 400,000 workers were on strike, and South Korea's biggest industries were shut down, including car manufacturing and shipbuilding. After the New Year break, white-collar workers started to join the strike as well in industries like banking, insurance, the media, and health services. Intermittent strikes involving 3 million workers took place over a period of 3 weeks, until Kim agreed to withdraw the law and draft a new one. But the new law, which passed in March, was only slightly different from the previous one. It still allowed massive casualisation and allowed workers to be fired more easily. Instead, union officials achieved concessions for their own organisations, with the government partially recognising the KCTU, which was technically illegal before, and granting rights for multiple unions to be established in the same industry, which previously wasn't allowed because of the FKTU being the only permitted union. South Korea was then hit by a financial crisis, and Kim Dae-jung was elected president. His government negotiated a bailout from the International Monetary Fund, which demanded restructuring of the economy. Principally, this restructuring demanded further casualisation of labour and massive layoffs. Officials of the KCTU union agreed to the layoffs in return for full legalisation of their organisation. Wages and jobs were slashed, and the number of unemployed people rocketed from 658,000 in December 1997 to 1.7 million a year later. KCTU leaders were fiercely criticised by rank-and-file union members for agreeing to the job cuts. Since then, casualisation and layoffs have been the primary method of dividing the Korean working class and keeping workers in check. As of 2023, 37% of South Korean workers are casual or non-regular workers. Casualisation is also distinctly gendered, with 56% of casual workers being women. The average pay for casual workers is nearly 50% less than for permanent or regular workers, often for doing exactly the same job. Union representation is almost solely for permanent workers, and in many cases, unions try to defend the privileged position of permanent workers, often at big companies, compared with casuals and workers at smaller enterprises.
Like the progressive political party movement, the labor movement has been criticized for being centered around labor unions in large corporations. Currently, issues such as irregular employment and various labor rights under platform capitalism need to be brought to the forefront, but the KCTU is unable to fulfill such a role, and organizing in these areas is also difficult.
제가 해고된 시절로부터도
It's been 36 years since my time, and I still find so much sorrow in the fact that in Korea, layoffs have become so commonplace. Back when I was laid off, companies just had minor layoffs. At the chicken factories, for example, only small numbers of workers were laid off at a time. But now these mass firings, they call it cleanup layoffs. You see Sangyong Motors laying off 2,640 workers at a time.
The Sangyong Motors strike of 2009 was an iconic dispute of recent South Korean history, which we plan on making an episode about in the future. Many people may be aware of this strike without realizing it because it's the strike depicted as the one the protagonist took part in the hugely popular Korean Netflix show Squid Game. Facing mass layoffs, workers went on strike and occupied their plant. They managed to hold it for 77 days of almost military-level siege by police. While workers' wives and families provided food, around 1,700 workers stayed inside the plant and defended it from assaults by up to 3,000 police, company thugs, and scabs wielding weapons like petrol bombs and slingshots. In response, the occupiers made their own catapults, using nuts and bolts from the factory, burning tires and petrol bombs to defend the plant, and workers from nearby factories often came to assist them. When water was shut off, the workers captured rainwater and made makeshift toilets out of barrels. Despite their heroic resistance, eventually employers succeeded in taking back the plant with violence, and the strike was defeated. At least 5 strikers or strikers' wives died by suicide during the dispute. With victory for the employers, South Korean corporations were even more emboldened to make layoffs.
제가 해고될 당시만 하더라도 치킨 노동자들이 극소수가
400 workers laid off here. Daewoo laid off 330 workers at a time. And these mass firings are cutting out hundreds, thousands of workers at a time. These mass firings, these quote-unquote cleanup layoffs, that's become the norm in Korea. And with these mass firings, workers must fight and struggle on the streets for years. That's the situation now. And those who are even able to find work again, it's all irregular and unstable jobs. Especially teens and young adults entering the workforce, they're entering a society where these irregular and unstable jobs are all you can start off as a worker. Our young workers are entering this environment in which the government has zero respect for labor and for workers. This environment of disrespect for our labor is incredibly painful for me.
노동의 문제가 주요 화두였다면
Now there is a task of addressing inequality, including external aspects of labor, such as irregular workers and precarious work. Additionally, there are many recent incidents regarding gender inequality issues. I believe these issues need to gain more attention.
A growth in the feminist movement has helped bring the issue of gender equality much more onto the agenda, including within progressive and working class organizations.
진보 진영 내에서도 이런 어떤 그
Within the progressive camp, there was also a logic of protecting the organization. So when sexual violence incidents occurred within the progressive organization, there were many attempts to cover up the incident under the pretext of the organization's survival and growth. However, by neutralizing these attempts, gender issues were brought to light externally. Additionally, minority issues now need to come to the forefront.
One of these minorities is South Korea's migrant workers, who are mostly from elsewhere in Asia, from countries like Cambodia, Nepal, and Indonesia. They're denied many basic employment rights, like the right to change jobs, and they work in more dangerous conditions. So, for example, although migrant workers only make up 9% of South Korea's manufacturing workforce, they make up 18% of those killed in industrial accidents. Some migrant workers who tried to unionize have been arrested and deported. Still ever present is the legacy of partition of Korea after World War II, between the north, backed by the Soviet Union, and the south, which was occupied by the US.
지금도 정전협정이잖아요. 아직 우리는 뭐
Therefore, overall Korean society remains divided between North and South, and it's still in a state of armistice, not peace. Despite the need for a peace declaration and societal change, the Korean peninsula still faces the risk of war between North and South. In this situation, leftist or socialist ideologies are considered enemies in South Korean society. There is still national security law in place.
South Korea's national security law has its roots in the Cold War and the divide between North and South. And according to legal scholars, it is one of the most draconian in the world. It forbids all kinds of activism, like cooperating with or even just praising or communicating with anti-state groups. These crimes can be punished with sentences of between 2 and 10 years imprisonment or even death. Even failing to inform on anti-state activities is a crime punishable by up to 5 years imprisonment and huge fines. Both Kim Dae-jung and Kim Young-sam were imprisoned under the law, which remains in force even though both Kims subsequently served as presidents. Park No-hae, the worker poet we mentioned earlier, was one of many people who still suffered severe repression under the new democratic governments. He was imprisoned in 1994 for, quote, organising a revolutionary communist labour organisation, end quote. That said, the restoration of democracy still marked a qualitative change in terms of political freedoms and civil rights, and most kinds of political and workplace organisation had become legal.
그래서 그 민주화 운동, 87 민주화 운동이
1987 was a turning point where the underground illegal student movement transitions into a public movement. Of course, there was an unfortunate event of the rise of Roh Tae-woo, a key figure in the military dictatorship, to the presidency. However, it seems that the 1987 democratization movement marked the end of the officially oppressive phase. So, although there were still underground illegal movements in Korean society afterwards, by the 1990s, most of them had transitioned into civil movements.
But today, problems in South Korean society remain.
한마디로 얘기하면은 한국 사회가
It seems that Korean society is engulfed in extreme levels of hatred and negativity. Issues regarding the improvement of people's quality of life, discrimination, and equality seems to be overshadowed by such the politics of hate. South Korea is facing very serious issues with real estate.
Like in many countries around the world, housing prices, especially in major cities, are increasing much faster than wages. Rental prices in Seoul have increased by 35% relative to wages in the past decade, which has been the major contributing factor to a decline in its population by over 850,000 people over that time period.
그리고 빈부 격차의 문제는 더 심해질 것 같아요.
Moreover, it seems that the wealth gap problem will worsen. Therefore, we need solutions to address this disparity. Anyway, all of these issues are being overshadowed by the politics of hate. So, in that regard, I hope for an era where this trend of hatred can be transformed into positivity.
Despite all of the measures successive governments have taken to undermine popular power, ordinary people have shown they can still exert it if they wish.
근데 87년도 그렇고 촛불항쟁
The June uprising and the candlelight uprising demonstrated the tremendous power of the people. But in terms of politics and policies, we could not make many significant achievements.
The candlelight uprising referred to here was a series of mass protests in 2016 to 17, involving 16 million people, which toppled the right-wing government of Park Geun-hye, the daughter of the former dictator Park Chung-hee, following a corruption scandal. But what followed her government wasn't a huge improvement, given the limitations of electoral politics.
사실상 우리가
Of course, it was challenging due to the strong two-party political landscape in Korea. Therefore, when people vote, they often choose not based on whether they like the policies or trust the person, but rather out of dislike for someone else or a desire to prevent someone else from being elected.
For Kim, her participation in the struggles of 1987 was a defining moment of her life.
너무 많은 시민들이 고리로
That I was present in the fight for such a significant time in Korean history, that's work that I hold great pride in.
Since then, she spent her life fighting for the working class and against her own dismissal back in 1986. In 2011, Kim famously staged a sit-in on top of a 35-metre tall crane in the shipyard from which she was fired, in protest at a wave of mass layoffs. Her protest sparked solidarity actions around the country, and eventually, after 309 days, led to a deal in which nearly 100 fired workers were rehired. And in 2022, after 37 years of struggle, Kim was eventually also successful in winning symbolic reinstatement to her old job. It was symbolic because she technically passed retirement age in 2020, but she did win back wages. And from what she learned from this lifetime of activism, rather than just vote for least worst politicians, what we actually need to do to improve things is clear.
더 많은 노동조합이 필요하고
I think that there is a need for more labor organizations, especially for these irregular, unstable types of work. Workers need to come together in solidarity and join forces. The workers themselves need to demand the change. As a person who lived as a worker and lived the life of a labor organizer, if there's anything I've learned and know with every bone in my body, it's that the future of the working class is not driven or changed by anyone else but the workers themselves. No other person will change the fate of the workers. You must do it yourselves. In order to change your own fate as a worker, you must join others, and if needed, you must fight and struggle. Only the workers themselves have the power to change the lives and future of the working class.
That brings us to the end of this double episode, which we've been working on and off for the last 3 years. If you enjoyed it, please consider supporting us on Patreon. It's only because of support from listeners like you that we're able to do this work and cover our costs. In return for your support, you get early access to content as well as ad-free episodes, exclusive bonus content, discounted merch, and more. So if you appreciate our work, please do think about joining us at patreon.com/workingclasshistory. Link in the show notes. If you aren't in a position to support us right now, don't worry about it. Please just tell your friends about this podcast and give us a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. As always, we've got sources, links to more info, transcripts, and more on the webpage for this episode. Link in the show notes. Thanks also to our Patreon supporters for making this podcast possible. Special thanks to Jameson D. Saltzman, Jazz Hands, Fernando Lopez Ojeda, and Jeremy Cusimano. We are very grateful to a number of other people for helping with these episodes, including Hwang Jeongeun and Steven of the International Strategy Center, Kwon Beomchul, Angela Lee, Kap Su Seol, Hwang Yi-ra, and Loren Goldner. Theme music for this episode was Marching for the Beloved, about the Gwangju Uprising, by Baek Ki-won, Hwang Sok-young, and Kim Jong-ryul. Link to stream it in the show notes. This episode was edited by Jesse French. Finally, thanks to you for listening. Catch you next time.